In January 2001, Capcom released a game that probably should have felt familiar. Fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, locked doors, puzzles, limited healing, a mansion full of things that really wanted you dead. Only, this wasn't Resident Evil. There were no zombies, no shotguns. Instead, you were a samurai in 16th century Japan, carving through demons with a sword and sucking their souls through a magical gauntlet. It was called Onimusha Warlords, and almost immediately it became huge. Onimusha became the first PlayStation 2 game to sell 1 million copies. The original was eventually past 2 million, and Capcom wasted no time turning it into one of its major new franchises. A sequel arrived the following year, then spin-offs, then another sequel, then Reno somehow got involved. By 2004, Onimusha had reached that wonderfully level of early 2000s excess where a 16th century samurai could travel through time, meet a French police officer and fight demons underneath modern Paris, and everybody involved seemed perfectly comfortable with this. Then in 2006, Capcom tried to reinvent the whole thing. New protagonist, new combat systems, more RPG mechanics, a bigger adventure, a new beginning. Onimusha disappeared. Not for 3 years, not for 5, for 20 years. It skipped the PlayStation 3 generation, then the PlayStation 4 generation, and very nearly the PlayStation 5 generation as well. During that time, Resident Evil reinvented itself several times. Monster Hunter became one of the biggest franchises in the world, Devil May Cry came back, Street Fighter came back, even Bloody Dragon's Dogma got another one. Meanwhile, Onimusha became something you occasionally saw mentioned in lists called Capcom franchises we wish would return, which is usually where old video game series go to die. And the strange thing is, Onimusha wasn't some forgotten cult series that sold 12 copies in Wolverhampton. By the end of 2011, the franchise had sold around 7.9 million games. People inside Capcom apparently still wanted to make another one. So what happens? How does a franchise go from becoming the first million-selling game on the PlayStation 2 to spending 20 years without a new main entry? And why has Capcom suddenly decided that 2026 is the right time to bring it back? Because there wasn't one catastrophic failure that killed Onimusha. Its decline was much slower than that. Its original story ended, sales began falling, Capcom attempted a reinvention, the industry moved into a new generation, games became larger and more expensive, and suddenly Onimusha was competing for resources against franchises growing much faster than it was. For 20 years there was always something more important, until eventually there wasn't. Because in 2026, Onimusha is back, a completely new mainline game, Onimusha Way of the Sword. 25 years after Samanosuke first raised the Oni Gauntlet, Capcom is trying again, and to understand why that matters, we need to go back to a very different Capcom, a very different PlayStation, and an idea originally described in the simplest way imaginable: Resident Evil with samurai.
Something is wrong within the Inabayama castle, and I fear that it might be the work of monsters. I am so scared, Samanosuke. I can only hope that you receive this letter and that you will find it in your heart to come and save me before it is too late.
Samanosuke.
I will save Princess Yuki.
The story begins around 1997. Resident Evil had only released the previous year, but Capcom already knew it found something important: exploration, locked rooms, puzzles, limited resources, fixed camera angles, pre-rendered environments, and the creeping suspicion that opening absolutely any door could ruin your afternoon. Producer Yoshiki Okamoto began considering what else Capcom could do with that formula. What if Resident Evil took place in feudal Japan? Instead of a mansion filled with zombies, you'd explore an old Japanese castle. Instead of guns, you'd fight with swords. And instead of biological horror, the enemies would come from Japanese mythology and the supernatural. The concept became known internally as Sengoku Biohazard. Biohazard, of course, being the Japanese name for Resident Evil, and this wasn't simply an idea scribbled on a whiteboard. Onimusha originally entered development for the original PlayStation. That version existed, it was shown publicly, footage and screenshots survived, and looking at it now is fascinating. It's recognisably Onimusha, but trapped inside late 90s PlayStation technology, chunkier characters, simpler environments, something that looks much closer to a genuine Resident Evil spin-off. Then Capcom made the decision that would transform the project. The PlayStation version was cancelled, Onimusha moved to the PlayStation 2, Sony's new hardware allowed Capcom to rethink the scale of the game. More detailed characters, better animation, more elaborate battles, more cinematic presentation, and particularly important for Onimusha, more convincing human faces. Because Capcom didn't just want to create a samurai protagonist, it wanted to cast one. Japanese-Taiwanese actor and singer Takeshi Kaneshiro became Samanusuke Ake. Capcom used his face, his voice, his movements, facial casts and motion capture helped transform a real celebrity into the game's protagonist, and Kaneshiro even contributed ideas during development. Capcom talked about the concept almost like it was creating a digital actor. Today, celebrity performances in games are completely normal. In 2000, this still felt futuristic, and it became one of Onimusha's defining traditions. Kaneshiro, Yusaki Matsuda, Gene Reno, and eventually Toshiro Mifune. Onimusha wouldn't simply create heroes, it would cast them. The move to PlayStation 2 also allowed Capcom to lean heavily into cinematic spectacle. The opening movie immediately announces what kind of game this wants to be. Armies collide, horses charge, arrows fill the air, Oda Nobunaga takes an arrow through the throat. This wasn't the quiet opening of the original Resident Evil. Capcom wanted a playable supernatural samurai film, and when Onimusha Warlords finally arrived in January 2001, players discovered that the Resident Evil comparison only explains half of it.
Flee while you can, you worthless bug! Useless!
No!
Pitiful humans!
Structurally, the family resemblance was obvious. Fixed cameras, pre-rendered backgrounds, keys, puzzles, healing items, rooms containing unpleasant surprises. But then Samanosuke pulled out a sword. Combat changed everything. Instead of slowly lining up shots against zombies, Samanosuke blocked, countered, switched weapons and attacked enemies directly, and defeated Genma, released glowing souls. Red souls strengthened weapons and equipment, yellow restored health, blue restored magic. Hold a button and those souls streamed across the screen into the Omni Gauntlet. It's such a simple mechanic, but it gave Onimusha an identity almost immediately. Kill, absorb, upgrade, repeat, and while you're standing there vacuuming supernatural energy into your arm, try not to get stabbed by something else. The other defining mechanic was the icing. Attack at exactly the right moment as an enemy strikes, and Samanosuke performs a devastating counter. Miss the timer and you get hit. Land it, and for approximately 4 seconds, you feel like the greatest swordsman who ever lived. The mechanic would survive virtually every reinvention of Onimusha. 25 years later, it's still central to Way of the Sword. The story itself begins in 1560. Onimusha immediately rewrites history by killing Oda Nobunaga at the Battle of Okayazama. Historically, he won, so we're already taking some liberties. Samanosuke later receives a letter from Princess Yuki concerning disappearances at Inabiana Castle. He arrives with Kunoichi Kaede and discovers the Genma have kidnapped Yuki. Nobunaga has been resurrected, the Genma intend to use Yuki in a ritual, and Samanosuke receives the Oni Gauntlet, giving him the power needed to fight them. It's historical fantasy with absolutely no interest in apologising for itself. No secret laboratory, no virus explaining the demons. Nobunaga has been resurrected by monsters. You have a magical glove, go and deal with it. The whole thing is surprisingly compact. A first playthrough can take around 5 or 6 hours. Once you know the route, consider considerably less, but that brevity gives Warlords an almost arcade-like replayability. The game grades your performance, time, enemies defeated, souls collected, play well enough and you can earn the Onimusha rank, finish Onimusha successfully enough, and the game confirms that you are Onimusha. Fair enough. Reviews generally praise the atmosphere, presentation and combat, although the game's short length and Resident Evil style controls attracted criticism. Tank movement works reasonably well when you're slowly navigating zombies, it's slightly less elegant when 3 demons are surrounding you with swords, but commercially, none of that mattered. Onimusha Warlords became the first PlayStation 2 game to reach 1 million sales. Eventually, Capcom's lifetime figures put the PlayStation 2 release at roughly 2.2 million copies. This wasn't a niche experiment, it was one of the PlayStation 2's first major hits. Capcom even expanded it onto the Xbox in 2002 as Genma Onimusha, adding areas, enemies and new mechanics, including a wonderfully cruel ability for enemies to absorb souls themselves. But by then, Capcom was already moving because development on the sequel had begun before Warlords had even finished, and rather than simply giving Samanosuke another castle, Capcom replaced him.
10 years have passed. A new hero arrives with the power. Onimusha lives.
Onimusha 2 arrived in 2002, barely 14 months after the first game. The new protagonist was Jubei Yagyu, and Capcom continued its digital actor experiment in an unusual way. Jubei was modelled after legendary Japanese actor Yusaku Matsuda, who died in 1989. Capcom worked with his family to recreate his likeness. Only 2 games in, Onimusha had established that its heroes could effectively be cast like film roles. Jubei's village has been destroyed by Nobunaga's forces. He discovers that he carries Oni blood, receives the power to absorb souls, and sets out for revenge. But Capcom wasn't interested in simply rebuilding Warlords around a new face. Onimusha 2 was much broader. The clearest example is a Masho town. Jubei can talk to people, shop, explore, and give presents to his friends. Yeah, in the middle of a supernatural war against Oda Nobunaga, Onimusha briefly becomes a friendship simulator. 4 major supporting characters can become involved in Jubei's journey: Aiki, Magaguchi, Kotaro, and Oyu. Give them items they like and their friendship with Jubei improves. Different characters can then appear during part of the adventure. Scenes change, some sequences become playable from their perspective. Different relationships create different material, and that makes the gift system much more important than it initially appears. Jubei may be trying to stop Nobunaga while carrying enough random presents to operate a small Christmas market, but underneath the joke is one of the sequel's cleverest ideas. Relationships can change the route through the game. Friends may appear to help, become temporary playable, or trigger different scenes depending on who Jubei is bonded with. You aren't necessarily seeing everything in one playthrough. You also have to learn what people actually like. Give somebody the wrong present and you get the video game equivalent of watching them unwrap it while desperately trying to remain polite. It sounds disconnected from Onimusha's central fantasy, but it gives the sequel, something Warlords didn't have, a reason to replay it and genuinely see different material. And that tells us a lot about Capcom's attitude towards the franchise this early. It wasn't interested in producing Warlords again with different castles. Only 14 months after the original, Onimusha was already experimenting with branching character relationships and RPG systems. That willingness to change would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of the entire series, and perhaps one of its problems. Combat was refined as well. The Isen returned, soul absorption returned, elemental weapons returned, but Capcom now understood that sword fighting wasn't simply something connecting the puzzles. It was one of the reasons people were buying Onimusha, and commercially, the sequel worked. Capcom's lifetime figures put Onimusha 2 at approximately 2.10 million copies, slightly more than Warlords. That's crucial to the story. If we're looking for the moment Onimusha began dying, this isn't it. Two main games, both with 2 million, the second replaced its established protagonist and still outsold the first. Capcom understandably saw a franchise worth expanding, so Onimusha began appearing everywhere. There was Onimusha Tactics on the Game Boy Advance, Onimusha Blade Warriors turned the cast into a multiplayer fighter, and even let Onimusha characters battle Mega Man EXE and Zero, because apparently historical accuracy has already left the building. Mobile games followed. Capcom was also considering a major live-action film adaptation. Onimusha was becoming more than a sequence of PS2 games, it was becoming a brand, and for the finale of the original trilogy, Capcom decided to push that brand harder than ever. Samanosuke would return, Nobunaga would return, the environments would become fully 3D, and somebody at Capcom decided the missing ingredient was Gene Reno.
Past and present collide. Experience the final chapter in the Onimusha trilogy. Two heroes, one destiny. Onimusha 3, Demon Siege.
Onimusha 3 was designed as the conclusion to the original trilogy. Samanosuke's conflict with Nobunaga was finally going to end, so naturally, the game starts in Paris. The story begins in 1582. Samanosuke is preparing to confront Nobunaga at Hono-ji when a time portal throws him more than 400 years into the future. Meanwhile, French police officer Jacques Blanc is pulled from modern Paris into 16th century Japan, and Jacques is played by Gene Reno. Actually, Gene Reno. Capcom used his likeness and motion capture, and Reno recorded Jackie's French dialogue. Onimusha had already cast famous Asian actors. Now its celebrity gimmick had gone international, and the game built itself around that clash. Samanosuke wandering through modern Paris, Jackie's fighting Genma in feudal Japan. Real Parisian locations were studied and recreated. Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower. The whole thing feels like Capcom looked at the restrained castle horror of Warlords and asked, how far can we possibly get from this in 3 games? Technically, Demon Siege represented another major evolution. The pre-rendered backgrounds were replaced with fully 3D environments, analog movement finally replaced the old tank controls, and 2 protagonists played differently, with Jackie's using supernatural whip-like weapons that could attack and interact with the environment at range. The time travel structure also allowed items and actions to affect the other period. The production became more cinematic than ever. Donnie Yen was involved in action direction for the CG sequences, while Takashi Yamazaki, long before Godzilla -1, was involved in the cinematic production. The opening movie is enormous. Armies, demons, acrobatics, elaborate sword fights. It is Onimusha at maximum early 2000s confidence, and it's worth appreciating just how absurdly enormous this has become in only 3 years. Go back to the original pitch, Resident Evil in a Japanese castle, that's basically it. By 3 games, Capcom is photographing Paris, digitising Gene Reno, working with international film talent, building fully 3D environments, choreographing elaborate CG battles, and writing a time travel story connecting modern France with 16th century Japan. This wasn't simply sequel escalation. Capcom clearly wanted Onimusha to feel like an international entertainment property. The celebrity casting that had begun with Takashi Kaneshiro was now being used as part of that ambition, and Gene Reno wasn't an obscure choice. By this point, he had appeared in films such as Leon the Professional, Mission Impossible, Ronin and Godzilla. Western players could look at the box and recognise the man standing on it. Even the opening cinematic demonstrates how far the production had moved beyond the relatively constrained first game. Donnie Yen's involvement helped give its action a martial arts film quality, with performers moving through elaborate choreographed battles rather than simply reproducing video game attack animations. It feels like Capcom was making a statement. Onimusha is a blockbuster now, and that's what makes the sales decline particularly interesting. If Demon Siege had been a visibly cheaper or less ambitious sequel, failing sales would be easy to explain. Instead, Capcom spent 3 games making Onimusha bigger, more cinematic, more technically modern, more internationally recognisable, and the audience still became smaller. That doesn't mean the ambition caused a decline, but it does mean that simply spending more money and making Onimusha more spectacular wasn't solving whatever problem was beginning to develop, which becomes extremely important when Capcom has to decide whether to reinvent the series again. And underneath all that excess, the trilogy actually reaches its ending. Samanosuke finally defeats Nobunaga, the conflict that had driven all three games is over. That's important because Capcom hadn't originally built Onimusha as an endless numbered series. The trilogy had reached its planned conclusion. If Onimusha continued, it would need another reason to exist, and commercially, there was now another warning. Capcom's figures put Onimusha 3 at roughly 1.52 million copies, still successful, but noticeably below the 2 million plus sales of the first two games. The wider action market was changing incredibly quickly. Ninja Gaiden had returned, Prince of Persia had modernised movement and platforming, Capcom itself had Devil May Cry, and in 2005, Resident Evil 4 was about to completely rewrite expectations for third-person action. Onimusha was evolving, but so was everything around it. Capcom certainly wasn't treating it as dead. Around this period, plans for a live-action Onimusha film became surprisingly serious. Producer Samuel Hadida became involved, and eventually, Silent Hill director Christoph Gans was attached. Reports put the planned budget above $70 million, with production expected to take place in China and Takahashi Kenshiro linked to the project. The movie ultimately stalled and disappears, but the fact it progressed that far tells us something important. After Onimusha 3, companies were still discussing Onimusha as a potential international film franchise. The series wasn't dead, its original story was simply finished, so Capcom needed to decide what came next. Its answer was not Onimusha 4, it was a new beginning. In Japan, the next game was called Shin Onimusha Dawn of Dreams. A new Onimusha, that was the intention, a new protagonist, a new cast, new villain, new systems, and no celebrity lead. Instead, Capcom created Soki, the Blue Demon. The story moves towards 1597, Nobunaga is gone, but the Genma have attached themselves to another major historical figure, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Soki travels Japan destroying Genma trees and gradually gathers a party around him. Akane Yagyu, Roberto Freud, Ohatsu, and the mysterious monk Tenkei, who eventually turns out to be Samanosuke. Apparently killing Nobunaga doesn't qualify you for retirement, it just means you come back later dressed as a monk. This party fundamentally changes how Onimusha worked. Characters had different weapons and abilities, you could switch between them, partners could receive basic commands, weapons and equipment became much more important, areas could be revisited, the camera was now freely controlled, and the adventure was significantly larger than the original games. At this point, Onimusha had travelled a remarkable distance from Warlords. Put it directly beside Warlords, and the difference is enormous. The original is almost aggressively compact, one main hero, a small weapon set, fixed cameras, puzzles, short bursts of combat, and a campaign you can finish in an evening once you know the route. Dawn of Dreams wants to occupy you. Weapons can be collected and upgraded, characters develop individually, equipment matters more, areas can be revisited, and optional encounters. Dialogue and additional systems keep piling onto the combat, and rather than treating Soki's companions as occasional alternatives, the game builds its adventure around them. Each character has their own combat style. Akane is quick and agile, Roberto fights primarily with his fists and gauntlets, Ohatsu brings firearms, Tenkei uses a spear, Soki carries enormous swords. Switching characters therefore isn't simply changing the person standing on screen, it changes how you approach enemies and exploration. Their individual abilities can also open routes and reach things that other characters can't, giving the party system a purpose outside combat, and the icing system becomes more elaborate too. Capcom hadn't forgotten the mechanics people associated with Onimusha, it was trying to surround them with a much larger game. That's why I think describing Dawn of Dreams as simply the game that killed Onimusha does it a disservice. You can absolutely prefer the older games. I think there's something incredibly appealing about how clean and focused Warlords is, but Dawn isn't evidence of Capcom running out of ideas. If anything, it's evidence of too many ideas. The series had spent 5 years constantly expanding. Warlords established the formula, Onimusha 2 added relationships, towns and branching material, Demon Siege added fully 3D environments, analog movement, 2 timelines and a much larger cinematic scope, Dawn of Dreams added party mechanics, deeper RPG systems, a freer camera and a much longer adventure. Every game was trying to solve the question, what else can Onimusha be? And by 2006, that question may have created another one. What does Onimusha have to remain? Because the further Dawn moved towards action RPG territory, the further it moved away from the specific combination that made Warlords distinctive. That doesn't automatically make the approach better, but it makes the commercial problem much harder to diagnose. If people stop buying Resident Evil, Capcom can ask what people want from Resident Evil: horror, tension, resources, monsters. Onimusha had changed so much in 5 years that its identity was harder to isolate. Was the audience there for the horror, the samurai setting, the celebrity casting, the puzzles, the sword combat, the historical figures, the RPG systems, the cinematic presentation, the Genma? The answer was probably some combination of all of them, and that's not particularly useful when you're trying to design a multi-million-dollar next-generation sequel. Ironically, it would take Capcom 20 years to arrive at an answer. Not everything needed to survive, just the things that made somebody look at a game and immediately think, that's Onimusha. That's the irony of Onimusha's decline. Capcom hadn't refused to evolve it. After 4 major games, it may have evolved so aggressively that its essential identity had become difficult to define. Dawn of Dreams reviewed reasonably well and even won a Golden Reel award for sound editing. It wasn't some notorious disaster, but commercially there was a problem. Capcom reported roughly 640,000 copies across Japan, North America and Europe during the fiscal year in which it launched. Those figures aren't directly comparable with the lifetime totals of the earlier games, so we shouldn't pretend Dawn definitively stopped at exactly 640,000, but Capcom itself said the game had struggled in overseas markets. The direction was obvious, the expensive reinvention had not restored Onimusha's momentum, and the timing could hardly have been worse. The Xbox 360 was already out, PlayStation 3 was coming, the HD generation was about to make major console development considerably more expensive. If Capcom wanted another Onimusha, it now needed to rebuild it for new hardware after the audience just becomes smaller, and this is where the story usually ends. Dawn of Dreams sold badly, Capcom killed Onimusha, except 20 years later, we know that's too simple. Dawn of Dreams mattered. If it had sold 4 million copies, I'm fairly confident we wouldn't have waited 20 years for another Onimusha, but it wasn't the only problem. Look at what was happening inside Capcom. Resident Evil 4 had just spectacularly reinvented Resident Evil, Devil May Cry had established a clearer identity around fast expressive combat, Monster Hunter was beginning to build momentum, particularly in Japan, then came Dead Rising, Lost Planet, and eventually the return of Street Fighter. Onimusha wasn't simply competing against other games in shops anymore, it was competing against other Capcom games for Capcom's own resources, people, money, technology, time, and the move into HD development made all those things more expensive. The question wasn't, would anyone buy another Onimusha? Of course they would. The question was, should a large development team spend years making Onimusha instead of something else? And after Dawn of Dreams, the answer repeatedly became, not yet. This is the crucial piece that the modern Onimusha team has finally clarified. Way of the Sword producer Akihito Kadawaki has explained that people inside Capcom did want to make another Onimusha. The desire hadn't disappeared, the problem was assembling the necessary development team while Capcom's staff were occupied with other major franchises and new projects. projects. As games became larger, finding enough suitable people became increasingly difficult, so there wasn't one dramatic moment where Capcom killed Onimusha. It simply fell down the priority list, and every year that passed made returning harder. After 2 years, you can make a sequel. After 5, you probably need to reintroduce the series. After 10, an entire generation of players may have never touched one. After 20, even the design language of the original games belongs to another era. What does a modern Onimusha actually look like? Fixed cameras, tank controls, pre-rendered backgrounds, 5-hour campaigns. The longer Capcom waited, the more expensive answering that question became. So what killed Onimusha? Not one game. The trilogy has ended, its audience was shrinking, development was becoming more expensive, and Capcom suddenly had much more attractive places to put its people. Onimusha wasn't exactly killed, it was outcompeted inside its own company, and that explains why it could remain dormant for so long despite people still liking it. A catastrophic failure can force a company to make a decision. Onimusha was something much more awkward, a franchise Capcom could make but never quite needed to make, and yet the name never completely disappeared. After Dawn of Dreams, Onimusha disappeared from mainstream console gaming, but it didn't completely disappear from Capcom. That's an important distinction, because if you only follow the major games, the timeline looks ridiculous. 2006, Dawn of Dreams, nothing, still nothing. 20 years later, Way of the Sword. But underneath that enormous gap, Capcom kept finding strange ways to use Onimusha. Perhaps the strangest was Patch a Slot. If you're unfamiliar with Patch a Slot, imagine a slot machine and a pachinko machine as a child, and then covered that child in elaborate video game animations. Licensed Patchy slot machines are an enormous business in Japan, and Capcom adapted both Onimusha 3 and Dawn of Dreams, and according to Capcom, they were successful, which is particularly funny in the case of Dawn of Dreams. The game that spent years being blamed for killing Onimusha apparently found a perfectly respectable second career helping people gamble, so he wasn't useless after all, he was just in the wrong industry. More importantly, it demonstrated that Capcom still believed the Onimusha name had value. Maybe not enough to justify rebuilding the series as an expensive HD console game, but enough recognition to license and market. By the end of 2011, Capcom reported approximately 7.9 million cumulative sales for the Onimusha game series. This was never an obscure franchise, and Capcom hadn't forgotten that. In 2012, it returns again in an unexpected form, Onimusha Soul. This wasn't a new console adventure, it was a browser-based social strategy game, which probably wasn't the announcement somebody waiting 6 years for Onimusha 5 had in mind, but historically, Soul is more interesting than it looks. Capcom chose Onimusha for its first browser game as the company expanded into social and online gaming. Players developed territories, built armies, and collected characters from Japanese history and across the series. About as far from Samanosuke exploring a dark castle as you could get while keeping Onimusha on the title screen. It still found an audience. Capcom expanded it beyond Japan and later said that the Taiwanese version was revealing the Japanese release. Once again, Onimusha survived, just not in the form we were asking for. Then in 2014, the original game returned to the headlines for a completely different reason: the music. The soundtrack to Onimusha Warlords had been prominently credited to composer Mamoru Samuragoshi. Samuragoshi had built an extraordinary public reputation in Japan as a composer who continued creating despite supposedly losing his hearing. Then Takashi Nagaki revealed that he had actually begun ghostwriting music for him for years, including work associated with Onimusha. Questions were also raised about Samuragoshi's claims concerning his deafness. More than a decade after Warlords, Onimusha had somehow become attached to one of the strangest scandals in Japanese classical music, but eventually, Capcom started looking back at the games themselves. During the 2010s, digital distribution made older catalogues increasingly valuable. Capcom was remastering and releasing older Resident Evil games and bringing more of its catalogue onto modern hardware, and in 2018 it announced the return of the original Onimusha Warlords. The remaster arrived on modern consoles and PC across late 2018 and early 2019. It wasn't a full remake. The pre-rendered background environments remained, while character models were cleaned up, widescreen and modernised controls were added, and the soundtrack was replaced following the Samaguchi controversy. For the first time in more than a decade, a traditional Onimusha game was available on current hardware, and Capcom's comments about its performance were reasonably positive. Not Onimusha has sold 10 million copies and we're building 6 sequels, but also nobody bought this, back in the coffin. It would be tempting to say that the remaster directly caused the revival. People bought Warlords, Capcom saw demand, Way of the Sword happened, nice clean story, but we don't actually have evidence that it worked that simply. What we do know is that not long afterwards, something changed inside Capcom, but for the first time since Dawn of Dreams, the company wasn't simply finding another use for the Onimusha name, it was preparing to build a proper one again. Around 2020, the pieces finally came together. According to Way of the Sword producer Akihito Katawaki, Capcom reached a point where it could reconsider its development schedule for the coming years, and this time there was room for Onimusha. The right people could finally be assembled, but another thing had changed since the PS2 era. Capcom now had the RE engine. The engine originally debuted with Resident Evil 7 and gradually became the technological foundation for a huge part of modern Capcom. Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry 5, Resident Evil Village, Monster Hunter Rise, Street Fighter 6, Dragon's Dogma 2, and finally Resident Evil Requiem. Instead of rebuilding an entire technical foundation specifically to discover what a modern Onimusha should be, the developers could bring the series into an ecosystem Capcom already understood. That doesn't suddenly make a modern game cheap or easy, but it removed one of the enormous problems facing a revival, and Capcom itself was in a very different position. During Onimusha's absence, the company had gone through one of the strongest periods in its history. Resident Evil 7 successfully reinvented Resident Evil again, the remake of Resident Evil 2 became a huge success, Devil May Cry 5 revived a series that had itself spent years in uncertainty, and Monster Hunter World turned Monster Hunter into a genuine global blockbuster. Capcom had also become increasingly invested in the value of its older catalogue. The company has openly discussed reactivating dormant intellectual properties. That doesn't mean every abandoned Capcom game is automatically getting a giant sequel. I'm still waiting for Dino Crisis with everyone else, but it meant Onimusha was no longer competing for the resources inside the company struggling to decide what the future looked like. Modern Capcom had successful franchises, established technology, and increasing confidence that old properties could become valuable again. Onimusha also had something it arguably didn't have in 2006, a market already comfortable with major Japanese sword action games. During the years Onimusha was away, we got Nioh, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, Ghost of Tsushima. Japanese history, mythology and sword combat had demonstrated enormous international appeal. It would become easy to assume Capcom simply looked at these games and thought, samurais are popular again, find Onimusha, but the development timeline makes that explanation too simplistic. Capcom's own account focuses on the internal opportunity finally existing, the staff, technology, scheduling and the ability to actually build the thing. Modern enthusiasm for samurai games certainly doesn't hurt, but Onimusha hadn't suddenly become a good idea. Capcom had finally reached the point where it wasn't a worse idea than everything else those developers could be working on, and while that new game was being built quietly, the franchise started appearing publicly again. In 2023, Netflix released Onimusha Anime. The protagonist was Miyamoto Musashi, and his appearance was modelled after legendary Japanese actor Toshio Mifune. Mifune's connection to samurai cinema barely needs explaining. Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Sanjuro, and particularly relevant here, Hiroshi Inagaki's Samurai Trilogy, where Mifune himself portrayed Miyamoto Musashi. So Onimusha had returned to one of its oldest ideas, cast the hero, only this time it was combining perhaps Japan's most famous swordman with perhaps cinema's most famous samurai actor. The anime was overseen by Takahashi Miike as chief director and followed an older Musashi wielding an Oni gauntlet against the Genma. At the time, it looked like another unusual use of the Onimusha property. What nobody outside Capcom knew was that a new game had already been in development for years. Then came December 2024, the Game Awards, a dark feudal Japan, demons, a swordsman, and then red souls flying into an Oni gauntlet. For anybody who remembered the original games, that was enough. Onimusha Way of the Sword, coming in 2026, not a mobile game, not another remaster, not a patchy slot, a completely new main entry, 20 years after Dawn of Dreams, and once the announcement was public, Capcom began rebuilding the rest of the franchise around it. In 2025, Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny finally received a modern remaster. The highest selling Onimusha game was accessible again without needing a PlayStation 2. Capcom also experimented with Onimusha VR Shadow Team. Individually, none of these things would necessarily mean much. Together, the timeline was clear. The Warlords remaster, development of a new game beginning around 2020, the Netflix anime, the reveal, Onimusha 2 returning, then the first major new Onimusha in 20 years. From the outside, the resurrection looked sudden. Inside Capcom, it had been building for years.
力がみなぎるぜ
And that finally brings us to Onimusha Way of the Sword, the first completely new major game in the franchise since 2006. Capcom isn't treating this as Onimusha 5. You don't need to remember Samanosuke, you don't need to know Jubei, and you definitely don't need an explanation of why Reno once spent several hours whipping demons in 16th century Japan, although I recommend knowing that anyway. This is a standalone story, a new entry point built from the pieces Capcom believes actually define Onimusha: historical Japan, Genma, the Oni Gauntlet, soul absorption, icing, and sword fighting. The game takes place in Kyoto during the early Edo period. Parts of the city have been corrupted by a mysterious force known as Malice, bringing the Genma into the world, and the protagonist is one of the most famous swordsmen in Japanese history, Miyamoto Musashi. But this version of Musashi isn't particularly enthusiastic about becoming a supernatural hero. He receives an Oni gauntlet and gains the ability to absorb souls, but he wants rid of it. That gives the story an interesting angle the older games have never explored particularly deeply. The Oni gauntlet is incredibly useful, but what does carrying that power actually mean? And once again, Onimusha has cast its protagonist. Musashi is modelled after Toshiro Mifune, the same actor whose image was used for Musashi in the Netflix series, but Capcom's decision wasn't simply borrowed from the anime. According to the development team, Mifune was part of the concept for the game from early development, and Capcom spent roughly 2 years securing permission from Mifune Productions to use his likeness. It's an almost perfect continuation of the tradition started in 2001. Takahashi Kaneshiro as Samanosuke, Yusaku Matsuda as Jubei, Reno as Jack East, and now Toshiro Mifune as Musashi. In 2001, using an actor's face helped demonstrate what new hardware could do. In 2026, it isn't technologically remarkable anymore. Now it's simply part of Onimusha's identity, but the important question isn't who's playing Musashi, it's how the game plays, because Capcom had to decide which parts of a 25-year-old design still matter, and the answer appears to be not the technology. The original Onimusha was built around fixed cameras, pre-rendered backgrounds, and controls inherited from Resident Evil. Those things were essential to how Warlords worked, but they weren't necessarily what made it Onimusha, so Capcom had stripped the concept back to the fantasy. A swordsman against demons, deliberate sword combat, souls, the Oni gauntlet, historical figures colliding with supernatural friction, and particularly icing. That perfectly timed counter from the original games is central again. Read the enemy, wait for the attack, strike at the correct moment and punish them. 25 years after Warlords, Capcom is still building combat around the satisfaction of waiting until the last possible second and cutting something down in a flash. Way of the Swords expands that idea with parries, deflections and physical clashes between weapons. Capcom has talked extensively about giving sword strikes a sense of weight. Blades connect, enemies resist, attacks can be redirected, the environment can become involved, and that helps distinguish Onimusha from another Capcom action series. Devil May Cry already exists if you want to launch something into the air and hit it 17 times before gravity remembers its job. Onimusha doesn't need to be that. Capcom has described its goal as creating the pinnacle of swordplay action, but importantly, the developers have also stressed accessibility. This isn't simply an attempt to turn Onimusha into another brutally difficult Souls-like. Difficulty options are intended to make the game approachable while still allowing the combat system to have depth. That feels like the correct distinction. The goal isn't necessarily to make every enemy a 40-minute examination of your emotional resilience. It's to make fighting with a sword feel good. Soul absorption obviously returns. Kill Genma, release souls, pull them into the gauntlet, upgrade and survive. After 25 years, the basic loop still works, and visually, Capcom clearly knows how important that is. When Way of the Sword was first revealed, it didn't need Samanosuke, it didn't need Nobunaga, it barely needed the title. Show a swordsman pulling streams of red souls into a glowing gauntlet, and anyone who played the originals already knows what they're looking at. The setting is equally important. Onimusha 3 has expanded outward. Modern Paris, Reno, time travel, and attempt to make the series feel increasingly international. Way of the Sword is returning by becoming more specifically Japanese. Kyoto, Musashi, Mifune, historical architecture, swordsmanship, Japanese supernatural imagery. Capcom no longer seems worried that Onimusha needs a French police officer to make the concept internationally marketable. The world changed, Japanese games became more globally successful, samurai action became more globally familiar. What once might have been considered culturally specific is now part of the appeal, and perhaps that's one reason this revival feels much more natural now than it would have in 2008. Capcom doesn't need to modernise Onimusha by removing the things that made it so distinctive. It can modernise everything around them: the controls, the camera, the combat complexity, the graphics, the scale, but the central fantasy survives. That's probably the biggest lesson from 20 years away. The things that aged weren't necessarily the things that mattered. Fixed cameras and tank controls aged, pre-rendered environments became less common, but the Oni Gauntlet didn't, absorbing souls didn't, icing didn't, fighting demons with a sword didn't. Maybe 20 years away finally gave Capcom enough distance to separate the technology Onimusha was built with from the identity that made it Onimusha, and now there's only one question left: whether people still want it, because making one new game isn't the same thing as reinventing a franchise. Capcom had spent roughly 6 years developing Way of the Sword, assembling the team it couldn't assemble before, moved Onimusha onto RE Engine and spent years reintroducing the name. Now the audience decides whether there should be another one, and that's almost exactly where Capcom found itself 25 years ago. In 2001, it released an unusual samurai game with Resident Evil DNA and no guarantee anybody wanted it. Within weeks, 1 million people had bought it. In 2026, Capcom is making that bet again.
As for you, I suppose you'll hear about that gauntlet.
You've been working ever so hard. Alas, the time has come for the finale. I can tear you apart as many times as I like.
You need some more time in hell. You don't belong in this world.
So, what happened to Onimusha? It began as Sengoku Biohazard, Resident Evil with Samurai. It moved from PlayStation to PlayStation 2 and became one of the new console's first genuine blockbusters. The first game sold more than 2 million copies, the sequel sold even more. Capcom expanded the franchise, spin-offs, mobile games, celebrity actors, a planned Hollywood movie, Reno fighting demons in Paris. For a few years, Onimusha looked like one of Capcom's defining franchises. Then the original trilogy ended, sales declined, Capcom tried to reinvent the series with Dawn of Dreams. That reinvention failed to restore its commercial momentum, and at exactly the same moment, the industry moved into a more expensive generation. Resident Evil reinvented itself, Devil May Cry established itself, Monster Hunter started growing, new franchises needed resources, and Onimusha slipped down the list. Not because everybody inside Capcom suddenly hated it, not because one terrible game destroyed everything. There was simply always something else that made more sense to make, and that might be the most interesting thing about the entire story. Onimusha never failed dramatically enough to explain disappearing for 20 years. It simply stopped being essential. The name survived through patchy slot machines, browser games, remasters and anime, and people inside Capcom apparently kept wanting to bring it back, but wanting a game to exist and finding hundreds of people to spend years building it are two very different things. Eventually, around 2020, the balance changed again. The technology existed, the development schedules opened, the right staff could be assembled, Capcom was stronger, and the company finally had the opportunity to answer a question it had been putting off since 2006. What should Onimusha be now? The interesting thing is that Capcom had already spent the original series trying to answer that question. Onimusha 2 asked whether it could be more of an RPG, Demon Siege asked whether it could be more of an international blockbuster, Dawn of Dreams asked whether it could become a much larger party-based action game. Way of the Sword is almost the opposite experiment. Instead of asking what else Onimusha can become, Capcom is asking what it cannot afford to lose. The answer wasn't to recreate 2001, it was to keep the parts of 2001 that still worked. A swordsman, a moment in Japanese history, demons twisting that history into something darker, the Oni gauntlet, the icing, and those streams of glowing souls flying across the screen. In 2001, Samanosuke raised that gauntlet and helped Onimusha become the first million-selling game on the PlayStation 2. 25 years later, Miyamoto Musashi is raising it again. Everything surrounding him has changed. The hardware, the technology, the industry, Capcom itself, even the audience. But the moment those souls fly across the screen, you know exactly what you're looking at. It's Onimusha. For 20 years, it felt like a franchise that belonged on the PlayStation 2. Now Capcom gets the chance to prove that it never did, and whether Way of the Sword becomes the beginning of another 20 years or one final return after 20 years away, that's the only part of Onimusha's history that hasn't been written yet.
Dark creatures who gain strength from the atrocities they inflict upon the land. Thriving in chaos, their unrelenting horrors envelop our world in a malice that weakens the barrier between hell and earth.
And that's the story of Onimusha, at least for now. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe to Parasine, and let me know in the comments what your favourite Onimusha game is and whether you think Way of the Sword can finally bring the series back for good. If movies and TV are more your thing, you can also find me over at Parascreen, where I'm doing the same kind of deep dive retrospectives into film and television. And as always, a special thank you to the channel members for supporting Parasine and helping me continue making these ridiculously long videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.